Whereas as a government-to-government relationship, what they want now is they want to speak to your one tribal chairman versus, well, here's our tribal chairman that deals with our business, but we also have, for instance, on the Wind River, we have our 4 old men that we consult, that they're the keepers of our knowledge and should be consulted on every aspect of the tribe. But because we're so colonized, we've almost dismissed them in many of our decisions for our people today.
Hello, I'm Emmy DeGrappa. Each week, we bring you stories asking our guests the question, why? We learn about their passion, why they do what they do, why should we care, and what can we learn? What better place to explore the human landscape than from the state known for its incredible landscapes, Wyoming? And what better organization than Wyoming Humanities, serving our state for over 45 years, we share stories, ideas, and wisdom about the human experience. This is What's Your Why? Today, we are talking to Tarissa Spoonhunter. She is a professor of American Indian Studies at Central Wyoming College. Welcome, Tarissa.
Thank you.
Tell us, where did you grow up first?
So let me introduce myself in my language first.
Okay.
Dos, hinanana niehi bikana hisse, oki nintanikuna dosikstakiyaki. I grew up on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation next to Glacier National Park in Montana. I've been in Wyoming for the last 5 years as a professor at Central Wyoming College, but I am an enrolled Northern Arapaho.
Okay, so is it your mother or your father?
My father is Arapaho, my mother is Blackfeet.
Okay, so you actually grew up on a reservation in Montana.
Yes, I grew up on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation that's kind of adjacent to Glacier National Park, but also up to the border of Canada. So we have one band in the U.S. and we have 3 bands in Canada.
And what was that like growing up on the reservation?
Growing up on the Blackfeet Reservation, I felt like I kind of had the best of both worlds because my family is very, very highly educated for Native Americans, for tribes. They're very highly educated. My grandmother and her sisters were probably the first women to receive their Masters of Arts degrees in education. So going through K through 12, I had a relative in each school. Either they were my principal, one of my great aunts was my teacher, my parents became teachers. So I was fortunate to be able to see education as a value to tribes and kind of pushed me, but also being that I wasn't enrolled Blackfeet, I kind of faced some obstacles, more lateral violence on the reservation. So in a sense, it kind of pushed me, encouraged me to kind of keep pushing forward in education. But I'm still, like I said, I was raised there. I'm raised with Blackfeet teachings, oral traditions. I've attended Blackfeet ceremonies. My first name was Blackfeet, which was Natosikstakyaki, coming from the central bundle of the Blackfeet people, which translate into holy or sacred beaver woman. So I felt that being raised on the Blackfeet Reservation, I was able to receive, not only cultural pride in who I was as a Blackfeet girl and then a woman, but I also grew up on a ranch. My family were ranchers. My grandmother was a very successful rancher and probably one of the women that succeeded as ranching.
Do you think all reservations are different because the tribes have different cultures and customs? Do you see it different at the Wind River Reservation than where you grew up?
I think every reservation is unique. They all adapted to Western culture, technologies differently. I believe that, there are ranchers on the Wind River, but there's also probably a lot more ranchers on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation. It is a bigger reservation. It also has probably twice as much people, depending on the size and the need and, the sharing of resources with the Arapaho and Shoshone, I think, kind of limited, the possibilities of really being successful on the Wind River Reservation. But there are some families that's their livelihood still today, and, it helps them, make a living on the Wind River Reservation.
So was there a stigma growing up that you were going to get a white man's education, as they call it. Do you think that that's still true, or has that barrier been broken down?
I think that stigma is still alive and well. On any reservation, it's alive and well. I did grow up, like I said, not only was I not an enrolled member, and we'll be talking about that later today, but the fact that I was enrolled Arapaho living on the Blackfeet Indian Reservation, being taught by non-Indians, and a very mistrust for educational institutions because of the boarding school and missionary Catholic schools. So there was, I would say that there was a stigma. There still is a stigma. And it's been difficult as a professor, as a member that has benefited from education, to really try to show that education can be a tool for tribes. I mean, as of right now, our tribal leadership doesn't need an education. You don't need an education to run, for tribal offices, where I see education can be an enhancement to you as a leader, and also for your community and your younger people to kind of not necessarily replace traditional learning, but as a tool. And I think for many people, Western education is a threat. And a lot of it is just because it's deprived traditional language, culture, and traditional learning from continuing. And so we're kind of in a crisis right now in trying to really capture that oral tradition, that very few of our people have, where you went from having 256 fluent speakers for the Arapaho people 5 years ago, and we're now down to 53. And so we are in a crisis. So I think right now the way to save it, because most of our children are trained in Western education and computer technology, smartphones, we have to step up to the times. But yet it is seen as a break of tradition, of not following traditional protocols. We shouldn't have to write this stuff down. We shouldn't have to use computers, what is, a way to use these tools to help our people. And for me, that's where I see education is important as a tool, but not to totally replace, because I know it takes away that face-to-face conversation. But I also see the benefit of education that, together, I think if we integrated both traditional teachings and technology, that we're in a better position to help carry on, that traditional knowledge, share the oral tradition and language with our children and our grandchildren.
Do you think the young people are facing an identity crisis because they're trying to figure out who they are as Native American people and then how they fit into the rest of the world?
I believe so. I think not just young people, but even people my age still struggle with that identity, because we know we're a member of a tribe, but Western education teaches us to be selfish, individualistic, like those are the priorities in Western society. Whereas Native people, we still have an obligation to our people. We still have a role within our tribe. And so finding that balance of what is my role in my tribe versus, I need to be educated so I can get a better job to provide for my family, it becomes, a crisis for many people, because especially those that may not have a strong traditional foundation, they know that there's a part of them that they don't know about. So many of our people don't know the history, don't know the language, don't know the protocols. And so they struggle because they feel like that part of their life is missing. Whereas we find a lot of the people that do actually become educated actually come back to the reservation to learn about themselves, about their history, about their language, their culture, even their relatives. Because Western society focuses on the nuclear family. But as Native people, we've had to rely on our extended family to survive. We've relied on our siblings to help raise our children. We relied, on our parents to help raise our children. Traditionally in some tribes, you always gave your first child to help your mom and dad because they were older, and so you had someone younger to help them. Whereas in Blackfeet language, we call it kipitapokax, which means old lady baby. It's kind of that teasing term, but, those were kids raised by their grandparents, by their grandmother.
Oh, that's very interesting. How do you become a elder or a tribal leader on the reservation?
Okay, so I think that's, another misconstrued thing that a lot of people kind of think, well, you get old, you become an elder. For a lot of tribes, that's not necessarily truth. You may become a senior citizen, but for an elder, a lot of those people are viewed as people that are keepers of language, keepers of history, keepers of the bundles. There are some tribes that you don't necessarily become an elder ever. You may become the elder in your family, the oldest in your family, the patriarch or the matriarch. But for tribes, there's different ways to become an elder. So, for instance, a young man who have gone through transfers for the Blackfeet people, which maybe he started, 7, 8 years old. He went through one society, transferred 4 years, transferred into a new one. And so maybe by the age of 16, 17, he may be an elder because he went through all those ceremony protocols and those transfers to get rights, to gain knowledge. And that's what, as Blackfeet people, we have this concept of transferring knowledge, sharing knowledge, that everything that you do in life, you have gained those rights by taking time to learn that ceremony, learn that history, and it's not just ceremonial, it's the right to paint, the right to use plants to dye, paint for painting of teepees. There are different rights that are achieved. You earn the right to get up and speak, for your people. That's a right that's given. And so many tribes still have those customs and those protocols set in place. But in Western society, you may be considered elder just because you're 65 and older, whereas Native people, a young man who has went through our ceremonial way of life may be consulted upon. And so he could be an elder at age 18, 19, 20, depending on, what he did throughout his various transfers and gaining of knowledge and sharing of knowledge. So, elders is a big concern. And because of assimilation and acculturation, we have a lot of our people that automatically just kind of throw the elder term on someone that's old, but in reality, in our traditional way of life, elders are those of sacred knowledge, those that know our language and our history and have participated in our ceremonies, in our societies. And so a lot of times before colonization, we didn't just have one chief. We may had the chief that kind of oversees the tribe, but we also had society leaders. We also had bundle keepers, great warriors. Those were all leaders. So to come to a tribe and say, well, we want to speak to your leaders, you may have had to consult 10 to 20 different people. Whereas as a government to government relationship, what they want now is they want to speak to your one tribal chairman versus, well, here's our tribal chairman that deals with our business. But we also have, for instance, on the Wind River, we have our 4 old men that we consult, that they're the keepers of our knowledge and should be consulted on every aspect of the tribe. But because we're so colonized, we've almost dismissed them in many of our decisions for our people today.
That's so interesting. And yeah, probably very misunderstood. What do you think could be a really good bridge between Native Americans and non-Native Americans in terms of having understanding of what it's like to be a Native American, what it's like to grow up on a reservation? How can we make that happen? Because I think there's so many of those misunderstandings, just like the term elder or leader. I think there's I could think of a dozen things that I probably don't understand. But how do we bridge those gaps?
One of the things that, I've kind of come upon is, how do we bridge those gaps? Because I'm fortunate that I got the best, of both worlds. Maybe not as quite as strong in my traditional way of life, but really I think, education is key. Sharing of knowledge. We share knowledge, not necessarily saying our way is the best way, but to build those bridges is to share and come to an agreement. Whereas a lot of times natives have been consulted, for management, for the Park Service, Forest Service, water, animals, but rarely are they given a seat at the table, and that's one of the issues, for instance, just in my research, in showing how tribes have maintained their relationship with their landscape despite being limited access, despite being denied access and use rights. I find that many times, and I looked across the United States and I said, okay, is there any tribe that has a co-management agreement with any federal agency? And by co-management, we mean the ability to veto something if we don't agree with it. If it totally goes against our management, our use rights, is there that opportunity that we're equal at the table? But that's non-existent here in the U.S. We've seen in Canada and Australia, the Aborigines in Australia are actually asserting their sovereign powers and being able to say, no, we're going to control because we're caretakers of this earth. Whereas here in the U.S., it's kind of, we're consulted to bring in diversity on research. We're consulted because the Wind River Reservation is the only diverse population here in Wyoming. And so how do we begin to share knowledge? And it is to build those partnerships. Give the tribe a seat at the table. Listen to their, concerns. Let them share why this is important. But I guess a good example would be when Obama became president. I attended a think tank at Harvard University on Crown of the Continent, which was Yellowstone up into the Rocky Mountains. And one of the things, they asked me, I went in place of the vice chair who had other obligations. And at first, I was totally freaked out. Like, what am I doing here representing tribes? They didn't tell me exactly what to say. They just said, you're opening, this land conservation think tank. Like, how can land conservationists get through to Obama that this is a priority? We need to make this a priority without having to reorganize the whole conservation efforts. And so, I shared a story that when we begin our ceremony, we invite the wind, the rocks, the plants, the animals, the water, and the last to enter is the human beings. That without the environment, we couldn't have the ceremony that we have 2 times a year, our year after year. And so, when I shared that, it was interesting because we had lawyers, we had scientists, we had land managers, we had researchers, and a lot of them were like, that's what's missing in our work. We don't have that human connection. We're the specialists in our scientific field. We're great water lawyers, but we don't have that holistic view of landscape. And, and for me, I was like, tribes have always kept that as the thing that holds them together, the thing that ties them to their land, to their traditional land, to ceded land, to the mountains, to the animals, to the plants. And now we're such in a crisis with water, environmental impacts, clean drinking water, that it is really time to build those partnerships and to listen to each other rather than coming for, okay, a biologist may come in and say, I want to know about animals, plants, and it's so like as a Native person, okay, what hat am I throwing on today? They almost created like this schizophrenic person, as they created the schizophrenia for tribes. You're like, oh, they only want to know about this, but yet how can I tell them about this when it's tied to this? That we view everything from a holistic viewpoint rather than a scientific category. And we see now more that we have to start considering how each system affects each other rather than being the special. And a lot of non-Indians don't want to do that because they're the experts in their field. They don't want someone coming and saying, well, maybe your management should consider some of what we're doing here. And that's the biggest conflict right now with conservation because we have specialists in each of their field and forcing them to work and listen to others when they're considered their expert, that's a challenge to them.
Right.
But as Native people, we always, say, give people their time to talk, listen. Because as Arapaho people, one of the things, 4 old men work kind of still being listened to, I guess. Probably about 20 years ago, they directed the tribe. They're like, don't make a decision if it divides our tribe. If something is dividing our tribe, then don't make a decision. Let it sit back. Let's talk about it more. But a lot of times when we're faced with some of the issues, we're making reactive decisions without thinking, what are going to be the effects down the road. And so tribal people and non-Indians, probably our biggest fight right now is probably water. And, one of the concerns now was, we're in drought at times. Right now, the tribe doesn't have a good water system set in place to store their senior water rights. And one of the issues is, a couple summers ago when we were in drought, one of our communities wasn't getting water because the ranchers were taking the water. So the water that was coming into that community was basically the backwash from irrigation and the pesticides, and then having to be cleaned before being, given for people to be able to survive human life. We need water. Water is life. And one of the aspects is the tribe, because of their senior water rights and sovereignty and a nation within a nation, has the right to call the river. And when their water is constantly being taken before their own community can have drinkable water, that's a primary source, use right now. That should be the top source, is drinkable water. If the tribe was to call the river, those ranchers, those communities downstream would not have water. And so, I have to turn it on them and turn it on the non-Indians and say, okay, if you had the senior right claim, would they give the Wind River Reservation water? Would the ranchers care? And honestly, in talking to a couple ranchers yesterday, they was like, no. That's the reality. But yet you see over and over, the tribe has allowed that water to go downstream. The tribe has not put a cap. The tribe has not metered the water. But they have the right to do it. And if they did it, it would probably be a war. But
Wow.
Also as tribal people, we know that we can't deny people human rights. We can't be hoarders. We can't be greedy. We've never been greedy. We've never asked for everything. We know we'll never get the land back. We know that, there's things that the U.S. government violated us, but all we ask is for them to live up to their side of the agreement. Mm-hmm. And that's what we're asking. We're not asking for the land back. We're asking live up to what you agreed to do. You're getting free water because we're not calling the river yet, but walk in our shoes and then tell me, would you give us drinking water? And we know they won't.
Wow, Tarissa, you're a wealth of information. That's incredible. And probably something I, have not thought about, but just hearing you talk about it and the issues that, the Native Americans face, just in policy and, political decisions. But you're right, just having the conversation and sitting down and bringing the Native Americans to the table to talk about what, how do we build those bridges between each other and just having that understanding. So I just want to say thank you for being here today, and I really love your journey and all that you're doing. Thank you so much.
Okay. Ho-ho.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of What's Your Why, a production of Think Why, Wyoming Humanities. This has been executive producer Emmy DeGrappa. Please subscribe and never miss a show. For more information, go to thinkwhy.org.